Alexandria to Georgetown University to go to the computer lab, and would have an hour before they kicked me out of the computer lab to put I could get one program in that they would run overnight. Now, you guys nowadays, you get on your netbook or your laptop and you put something in and it would give you immediate feedback, right? This is one iteration overnight. So you get a printout the next day, right? So it would be drive down at 10 o'clock, run one program, find out what went wrong the next morning, try another one. At 10 o'clock that night, usually I would have a printout, find out what went wrong, run another one overnight. So if you had to go through 30 iterations, that was 15 days to get the 30 iterations in COBOL. But then I would get home, back to Arlington, right across the street from the Pentagon, and I would read Kierkegaard in the original text for my theology class. And I realized about halfway through the class that I had read 3 books and I had no idea what he said. Kierkegaard at 3 a.m. Just, wasn't and the worst part about this is I was in this class with mostly master's level theology students who would sit in class and they'd nod their head and take notes, and I'd nod my head and think about how eloquent the professor was, and realize afterwards I listened to an hour of what could have been, Aramaic or something. I had no idea what he was talking about, but it was very articulate, whatever he was saying. It would be like, listening to a lecture in Latin. If you'd never taken Latin, it was really kind of at that level. But so we'll congratulate her for her white phosphorus, right? So solve the problem. I will, to her dismay, tell everybody that she didn't have the yes sir, no sir, no excuses, I don't understand, sir. Although you could interpret it as I don't understand. I don't understand. What is this book? Okay. So I need a test by tomorrow? Yeah. How do I do that? There's a bookstore over there. But once you got over that, you solved the problem and exemplified the highest level of problem solving. Is that fair? So, a couple things. Let's go through the test a little bit. From going through, somebody give us, what would your definition of character be as it applies to what we do here? Yes, sir.
Sir, I would define character as what you do when nobody's watching, sir.
Okay, good. I've heard it said, the same thing you just said slightly different, is do everything as if it's going to be on the front page of the newspaper, right? So if you behave in that way, then it's a good iteration of character. By the way, do you guys watch the news and politics much? Do you see a high level of character displayed in politics nowadays on your side?
Bad character.
Well, if character is exemplified by taking the responsibility of the blame for what happens, or by behaving in private as if you were in public, we certainly see a lot of examples of the opposite, don't we? There's on both sides, it seems like all politics has become is one side blaming the other side for everything that happens, right? Did you see many of the interviews of George Bush with his bio that came out recently?
Yes, sir.
Whatever you think one way or the other, his language patterns were very good at taking responsibility for anything and everything that happened. Did you notice that?
Yes, sir.
And it seemed to me that perhaps what happens in our political environment is people get so affected by so many different people, because what he was saying on those interviews sounded differently, at least, than the last couple of years of his administration. And most of what happened in the last couple of years of his administration were being filtered through lots of layers of people, rather than coming from him directly. Would you agree with that? So I thought it was very interesting. It's an example of that in the political realm. And most of you are too young to remember. I'm too young to remember this other than by reading it. But John F. Kennedy, when we had the Bay of Pigs fiasco, one of the things that defined his character, do anybody remember what happened next? What happened next is he went on TV and said, we tried this thing, it went horribly wrong, it's my fault. Period and sentence, right? See, that doesn't happen much anymore, does it? right, is there's always the 28 layers of excuses and blame. And what happens is, for your own personal accomplishments, is if there's 5 or 6 things out here, factors to blame, even if that's right, does that help you achieve anything? No. See, it's always better to be inappropriately responsible for everything that happens, even if there are things that you can't control, than it is to look for external blame, because the only thing you can fix is you. Does that make sense? So, an example with like martial arts tournaments is, you know, forever, well, no, it seems like forever, but for 10 years, we promoted one of the biggest tournaments in the country, and therefore I was had to be a head referee at pretty much every major martial arts event in the United States. So that was 10 or 12 a year. And these are big, big, big events. And you could always tell the ones who were going to be very successful and the ones who weren't, because you would have people who are otherwise very highly talented who would talk about how they got cheated, or how the judges didn't like them, or have a list of reasons why. And sometimes, again, these are perhaps very talented people who would talk, who would afterwards complain about all the things that went wrong and why none of it was their fault. Now, what does that mean? It means they didn't go back and try to fix anything that kept them from moving up to the next level. I remember one of them was my student. He was from Washington, D.C., but he was one of the youngest black belts ever for he and his brother in the Junior Institute, and he became like number 2 or number 3 national competitor, but every time he didn't win, he blamed everybody but himself. And I remember one time he was talking to me, he said, well, the reason I never win first place is none of the judges like me. I said, well, Michael, you're exactly right. None of them do like me. I said, I was your instructor, and I have a hard time tolerating you from time to time. I'm serious, right? But see, what's he missing? Well, go ahead. Yeah. If he's losing because none of the judges like him, my question to him is, what have you done to fix that? His answer is, of course, nothing. I said, well, if you're losing because none of the judges like you, you can either, if it's false that that's the reason, or if it's true that that's the reason, either way, have you done anything to get them to like you a little bit better, right? And I'll tell you what, the number 1, number 2 people, what did they do when they were competing? They would go and sit politely at the ring. Before the competition, they would introduce themselves and recognize each of the judges. They would remember each of the judges' names, and they would recognize them, but introduce themselves as if they probably didn't know their name. They were very humble. They would also sit at the ring and applaud for everybody else and encourage everybody else. When they did their competition, they were very polite. What he did is he ignored everybody else, and he never said anything to the judges, and then he came in and did fabulous physically, but didn't do any of the other things to make sure that either the other competitors who all disliked him or the judges who disliked him changed their opinion. Okay? Does that stuff matter? Yes, matters a lot, right? So what else is a component of character in a way that we use it here? What's another component? I'll tell you another story about that. There was an interview with Jeff Smith years ago, and it was right after the one kickboxing fight that he had lost. And bunches of people, myself included, had talked about who the judges were and how they were biased in one thing or another. And then they interviewed Master Smith, and he said, well, none of that stuff matters. He says it's kickboxing. I didn't knock him out. So therefore, their opinion is the only one that counts. And he said, the only thing that I can control at this point is I can go back and train harder, so that next time it's so overwhelming, or that I knock him out, so that there's no subjectivity to it, right? Because if it's close, it's not, you can't argue about whether the judges were right or wrong. You've got to go back and train harder and develop more and so forth, right? Have you seen a lot of and if you watch the news, you see a lot of both, right? The media makes most corporate leaders look bad. Have you noticed that?
Yes, sir.
And the reality is that's not the truth. That's the cases of the Bernie Madoffs of the world who are crooked, which is probably less than 5%, certainly probably more than, no more than 3%, right? So you have 3% that are crooked, and the rest of them are trying the best they can. And some of them are as honest as the day is long, but that doesn't make good news, right? But if you watch in the news, you'll see two different things that happen. You'll see some of them come out publicly and take full responsibility for everything that's happening, even though it's unfair, right? Because there are external factors. And you'll have others that come out and talk about all the external factors and not in the context of what they're going to do to adapt, but in the context of nothing we could have done. This is all the stuff that happened to us. Have you noticed that?
Yes, sir.
And again, if you want to make a bet on who's going to do well and who's not going to do well, take the bet on the ones that take responsibility for everything.
Yes, sir.
Does that make sense?